The eyes of the lady depicted on this piece of fabric are literally alive. Well, yes. When the scientists looked at the eyes through an ophthalmoscope, they were shocked to realize that the iris reacted to light just like your eyes would.
Blood, altars, smoke, and fear, and by estimates, nearly 12,000 lives were taken in ritual sacrifice across 1531 Mexico, a reality noted in historical accounts referenced by Vatican News. Into that world walked Juan Diego, an indigenous peasant nobody listened to until a voice called to him on Tepeyac Hill. What followed wasn't just faith. It was a mystery science can't explain. But what happened on that frozen hill that is said to defy every law of nature? The hill where roses bloomed in winter. Winter grips the hills outside Mexico City. Frost clings to volcanic stone. The earth is dry, rough, almost hostile. The kind of ground where cactus survives because almost nothing else can. Then somehow, against every expectation, roses are blooming. December 9th, 1531. According to Vatican News, an indigenous convert named Juan Diego was walking toward Mass when he reached Tepeyac Hill and heard something that stopped him. Cold, beautiful music drifting across the slope where no musicians stood. A radiant woman appeared before him and identified herself as the Mother of God, asking for a church to be built on that very hill so she could show compassion and comfort to the people suffering around her. Here's where the story immediately gets complicated. Juan Diego wasn't a nobleman. He wasn't a military leader or a powerful priest. According to the Vatican account, he was an indigenous peasant living in a world where men like him rarely carried influence beyond their own villages. Yet he was told to bring a message directly to Bishop Juan de Zumárraga, the highest church authority in the region. Predictably, the bishop didn't believe him. Think about that for a second. If a stranger arrived claiming a heavenly figure wanted a church built on a hillside, skepticism would be the reasonable response. According to Vatican News, Zumárraga asked for proof, not faith, not emotion, a sign. 3 days later, on December 12th, Juan Diego returned to Tepeyac. The timing alone makes this strange. Winter had settled over the region. The hill was barren. Sources from Vatican News described the area as having nothing in bloom. Yet the woman directed him higher up the rocky slope and told him to gather flowers. And there they were. Not wild local flowers, not desert blossoms, somehow hanging on through the cold. Castilian roses. Roses from Spain. According to Vatican News and historical church records, these were flowers associated with Castile, a region thousands of miles away. They weren't native to Mexico, and they certainly weren't supposed to be growing from frozen volcanic ground in December. Juan Diego gathered them into his tilma, a simple cloak woven from coarse fiber, and carried them back toward the bishop. The details keep nagging at you. Why roses? Why Spanish roses specifically? Why choose a flower connected to the homeland of the bishop who demanded proof? When Juan Diego finally stood before Zumárraga and opened the tilma, the roses tumbled onto the floor. But the flowers weren't what made the room fall silent. According to Vatican News, an image had appeared on the fabric itself, imprinted where the roses had rested moments before. If the roses were the sign, what remained after they fell? The cloth that should have died 5 times over. Agave fiber doesn't last. That's not an opinion or a religious claim. It's simply how the material behaves. Woven from cactus fibers on a simple backstrap loom, a tilma like Juan Diego's was never designed to survive centuries. According to scientific information compiled by the Denver Catholic, the expected lifespan of an agave fiber tilma is around 8 years before deterioration begins to take over, and yet this one refuses to follow the rules. The image that appeared on Juan Diego's cloak in December of 1531 is still here nearly 5 centuries later. Not 50 years later, not 100, more than 485 years later. Here's the thing that makes researchers pause. For the first 116 years of its existence, the tilma hung exposed without protective glass. It faced candle smoke, humidity, dust, handling, and the countless environmental threats that normally destroy delicate organic fibers. According to the Denver Catholic summary of the historical record, it remained remarkably preserved. Most ancient artifacts survive because they're hidden away. This one survived while people stood directly in front of it every day. Then came the first disaster. In 1785, according to the Denver Catholic's analysis, nitric acid was accidentally spilt onto the tilma. If you've ever seen what strong acid does to organic material, you already know what should have happened next. The fibers should have burned, dissolved, or disintegrated. Instead, only a stain appeared. Even more strangely, the mark faded over time, rather than spreading through the fabric and destroying it. That alone would be enough to make conservators curious. But wait, it gets weirder. November 14th, 1921. A man named Luciano Perez placed a bomb concealed inside a flower arrangement beneath the image. According to the Denver Catholic, the explosion was powerful enough to damage the marble altar, bend metal candlesticks, and destroy nearby fixtures. A large crucifix was thrown by the blast. The tilma remained intact. Think about standing in that church afterwards. Debris everywhere, damage all around the image. Yet the cloth at the center of the explosion survived without the destruction everyone expected. Years later, investigators turned to photography. According to the Denver Catholic's report on research conducted by Dr. Philip Callahan in 1979, infrared analysis failed to identify characteristics normally associated with human painting techniques. Callahan concluded that significant portions of the image could not be explained through conventional artistic methods. Whether someone accepts that conclusion or challenges it, the study added another layer to a mystery already packed with them. Then researchers noticed something else. According to information cited by the Denver Catholic, measurements taken near the image suggested a stable temperature of approximately 36.5 degrees Celsius, essentially normal human body temperature. That's unusual because the image hangs against a metal support structure that experiences noticeable environmental temperature fluctuations throughout the year. At this point, the questions start stacking up faster than the answers. How does a coarse agave fiber cloth survive nearly 5 centuries when similar materials rarely survive a fraction of that time? Well, according to historical findings referenced by the Denver Catholic, a Spanish artistic evaluation conducted in the 17th century concluded that the coarse weave of the tilma wasn't suitable for the level of detail visible in the image. That's what keeps drawing people back. Not one mystery, not even two. It's the accumulation of them. Every generation seems to discover another reason this fabric should have disappeared long ago, and every generation finds it still hanging there. If the cloth refuses to die, what else is hiding in plain sight on its surface? The eyes that recorded history. Like a camera, 15 eye specialists are leaning over magnifying equipment, staring into irises barely 5/16 of an inch wide. They're not examining a patient. They're studying an image that, according to tradition, appeared on a tilma in 1531. And the deeper they look, the stranger the story becomes. According to research summarized by the Denver Catholic, examinations conducted around 1950 led multiple international ophthalmologists to report that the eyes in the image display characteristics consistent with living human eyes. What caught their attention were optical effects, resembling Purkinje-Sanson reflections, tiny reflected images that occur naturally in the structures of a real eye. Here's the thing, those optical principles weren't understood until centuries after the tilma first appeared. That alone would have been enough to spark debate. Then technology improved. Fast forward to 1979. According to the Knights of Columbus account, Dr. Jose Tonsman, a civil engineer with a doctorate from Cornell University, began analyzing highly enlarged digital images using technology available through Mexico's IBM Scientific Center. The goal wasn't to prove a miracle. He simply wanted to see what was actually present inside the eyes. What he reported finding changed the conversation entirely. As the digital enlargements increased, tiny shapes began emerging from the corneas. Not random marks, not cracks in the fabric, human figures. And get this, the eyes themselves are so small that the details shouldn't even be visible without significant magnification. Yet Tonsman reported identifying 13 distinct people reflected within them. At the center of the scene stood Juan Diego, according to the Knights of Columbus article, caught in the exact moment of unfolding his tilma before Bishop Juan de Zumárraga. Nearby appeared the bishop himself, focused on the image being revealed. An indigenous servant sat cross-legged on the floor. A Spanish assistant stood nearby. So did a translator, someone capable of bridging Spanish and indigenous languages during the encounter. The details become even more specific. According to Tonsman's analysis, one figure appears to be a black African female servant. Historical records referenced by the Knights of Columbus note that Bishop Zumárraga had such a servant in his household. Surrounding the central group were members of an indigenous family, including a mother carrying a child on her back, a father, grandparents, and 2 young children. Think about what that means for a moment. These aren't giant portraits hidden somewhere on the cloth. They're microscopic reflections, reportedly located inside eyes smaller than a fingernail clipping. Naturally, critics challenge the findings. That's expected with any claim this extraordinary. Yet according to the 2024 analysis published by Makuka, researchers examining the imagery continued noting that corresponding figures appear in both eyes. Even more intriguing, the positioning changes slightly between the right and left eye in ways consistent with the different viewing angles present in normal human binocular vision. Wait, it gets weirder. If the figures are genuine reflections, they obey optical rules. The people aren't randomly scattered. They're arranged around the central action, exactly where reflections would be expected to appear. The focal point remains Juan Diego opening the tilma. This is where Tonsman's theory enters the story. According to the Knights of Columbus report, he proposed that before the image appeared on the cloth, the individuals present in the bishop's room were reflected in the eyes of the woman being depicted. When the image became fixed on the tilma, those reflections were preserved as well. Whether someone accepts that explanation or rejects it, the scale of the claim is impossible to ignore. We're talking about 13 figures embedded within eyes so small that no observer in 1531 could have intentionally painted them. So if the image is really preserving something that precise, what deeper framework was already in place long before the apparition? And how did it shape the way this moment was understood when it finally arrived? The prophecy that predicted her arrival. Mainstream accounts rarely lean into this part of the story, but according to interpretations presented in Joseph Julian Gonzalez and Monique Gonzalez's work, Guadalupe and the Flower World Prophecy, there's a cultural thread in Mesoamerican thought that seems to anticipate something like the 1531 apparition long before it ever happened. And when you sit with it for a moment, it doesn't feel like a coincidence as much as it feels like preparation unfolding quietly across generations. Now here's where it gets interesting. The idea centers on what scholars call the Flower World Complex, a symbolic universe in ancient Nahua tradition, where flowers, music, and beauty weren't just decorative elements, but representations of a higher paradisal reality. According to the analysis presented in Guadalupe and the Flower World Prophecy, as summarized by the Guadalupe Shrine publication, this worldview carried themes of harmony, divine life, and a supreme creator woven into poetic expressions known as Xochicuicatl, or flower songs. Think about that for a second. Entire cosmologies expressed through poetry and flowers, not written theology. What Gonzalez and Gonzalez argue is that these symbols weren't erased when Christianity arrived, but instead found unexpected resonance within it. According to the book's thematic breakdown published by Sophia Institute Press, the authors trace how concepts like beauty, truth, goodness, life after death, and a single supreme God already existed in symbolic form within indigenous thought, creating what they describe as intellectual bridges long before Spanish contact reshaped the religious landscape. And get this, that bridge may explain something that still shocks historians today. According to a review by Hallowed Way, the authors connect this symbolic framework to what they describe as one of the largest mass conversions in recorded history, with estimates of around 10 million indigenous people embracing Christianity in a relatively short historical window after the Guadalupe apparition. Whether one interprets that as spiritual awakening or cultural convergence, the scale alone forces you to pause. 10 million people in a generation or less. Now here's where the narrative starts to tighten. The same flower world tradition also carried imagery of a perfected realm after death, a place filled with light, flowers, and renewal. When the Guadalupe apparition appears in 1531, it doesn't arrive with foreign imagery of destruction or dominance. It appears wrapped in symbols that indigenous audiences could already emotionally understand, even if the theological framing was different. According to the Guadalupe Shrine's interpretation of the Gonzalez work, that alignment between symbol and belief created a kind of shared language, something that allowed two worlds to communicate through meaning rather than force. But wait, it gets even more layered. Astronomical studies referenced in the Catholic Herald suggest that the star patterns depicted on the tilma correspond closely with the actual sky above Mexico City on the morning of December 12, 1531, including alignments that coincide with seasonal celestial configurations visible during that period. Whether interpreted as symbolic artistry or intentional design, the precision adds another dimension to an already dense mystery, and suddenly you're left sitting with this uncomfortable overlap. On one side, indigenous poetic cosmology speaks in flowers, harmony, and divine presence. On the other hand, a Christian narrative enters a land already rich with symbolic expectation. And somewhere in the middle, an event that seems to echo both languages at once without fully belonging to either. Every culture involved appears to recognize something familiar in what is unfolding, even if they describe it differently. Have you ever noticed how some stories feel like they were waiting for the right moment to be told, as the pieces existed long before anyone realized they fit together? That's the tension sitting inside this chapter, because if this framework holds even partially true, then the apparition isn't just a sudden historical moment. It becomes something closer to a convergence point, where belief systems that developed independently begin to reflect each other in ways that feel almost engineered. And that's where everything starts to tilt. The prophecy didn't just predict arrival in a simple linear sense. It created a symbolic space where that arrival could actually be understood when it happened. So if one image could carry meaning across worlds like that, what exactly was encoded into its symbols? And how did it manage to speak so clearly to two completely different civilizations at once? The code that converted 10 million people. Every detail on that cloak was coded. Two cultures looked at the same image, and both understood. And when you start pulling it apart, it's hard not to feel like nothing here is accidental. According to the Baltimore Archdiocese documentation on Guadalupan symbolism, The four-petaled flower placed on the figure's abdomen was read in Aztec tradition as the sign of the highest divine presence, the God above all gods, right in the exact position where Christian theology would place the source of life itself. That overlap alone is enough to make you pause, because it doesn't feel like a coincidence, it feels like alignment. According to analysis compiled by the Guadalupe Shrine Research Archive, the mantle also carries star patterns that correspond closely with the sky over Mexico City on December 12, 1531. The morning tied to the apparition narrative. Whether symbolic artistry or intentional design, the fact that the arrangement mirrors an actual historical sky has kept researchers debating for decades. But wait, it gets denser. In Aztec symbolism, that four-petaled flower wasn't a decoration. It represented the center of creation, the meeting point between earth and the divine. According to interpretations referenced in Guadalupe and the Flower World Prophecy via Sophia Institute Press, this symbol also carried the idea of renewal, the beginning of a new age of peace after cycles of destruction. Now here's where it gets interesting. The black sash around the waist signals pregnancy in Mesoamerican culture, which immediately reframes how indigenous viewers would interpret the figure. Add folded hands, lowered posture, and the absence of divine mask-like features, and the message shifts again, this time toward humility rather than domination. And get this, the layering keeps stacking. The crescent shape beneath the figure's feet is often read in Christian interpretation as the moon, symbolizing victory over older celestial forces. In Aztec cosmology, those same lunar associations carry deep spiritual meaning, so the imagery doesn't erase belief systems, it reframes them in a shared visual language. According to Hallowed Way's analysis of the Flower World tradition, that kind of dual symbolism is rare because it allows two interpretations to exist without conflict. The eagle-winged angel below the figure adds another layer. Eagles represented the sun and warrior spirit in Aztec tradition, while in Christian iconography, angels act as messengers between the divine and human realms. Here, both meanings sit in the same frame, reinforcing rather than competing. And that's the part that keeps pulling attention back, because when you step away from individual symbols, the entire composition behaves less like artwork and more like communication designed for multiple audiences at once. According to historical interpretations cited in Baltimore Archdiocese materials, this layered symbolism may explain why millions of indigenous people gradually accepted the Christian message, seeing familiar concepts reflected rather than replaced. That's not a small shift. That's cultural translation happening through imagery instead of language. And if you sit with that long enough, one question keeps circling back. 500 years later, the tilma is still here. What shocked you most? Was it the eyes, the prophecy, or the cloth? Leave a comment below, and we'll see you on the next video.